Thank you for taking the time to listen to the story. If you haven't already done so, please subscribe to our channel. We appreciate it, and thank you in advance. Please leave the name of the city you're listening from in the comment section below. It helps us see our reach in the community. Now, let's start the story. The Gulf of Guinea stretched endlessly around the drill ship Ocean Sentinel, its vast, shimmering expanse disturbed only by the rhythmic hum of machinery and the occasional distant spray of waves against the hull. The Sentinel was a colossal vessel, a marvel of modern engineering. At nearly 700 feet long, with a deck bristling with cranes, derricks, and equipment, it was a city unto itself. Below deck, endless corridors led to bunk rooms, dining halls, control rooms, and even the Citadel, a reinforced safe room designed for emergencies. Garrett leaned on the railing, gazing out at the horizon. His shift as a mechanical engineer had ended an hour ago, and he was savoring the last few moments of daylight before heading below deck. The salty breeze ruffled his dark hair, and his lean frame was relaxed, but his mind wasn't. Garrett had been on the Sentinel for nearly 3 years, and while he was confident in his skills, there was always a lingering tension when working in such isolated, dangerous waters. He had joined the industry as an escape, a way to avoid the small-town monotony he had grown up with. Here, every day brought new challenges, and that's what he'd loved, at least at first. But lately, he'd been questioning his decision. The isolation felt heavier, the risks more acute. He missed the simplicity of real connections, the warmth of a life not dictated by rotations and machinery. Still, he had a job to do, and Garrett took pride in doing it well. The day had been a busy one, with the new crew rotation underway. Helicopters had ferried fresh faces onto the Sentinel all morning, replacing the outgoing crew that had served their 28-day hitch. As always, the changeover brought a flurry of activity: introductions, equipment checks, and a detailed handover of responsibilities. Garrett had watched the process with a practiced eye, noting the energy of the newcomers. Among them, he'd spotted a few who seemed unusually pale and fatigued, their conversations punctuated by coughs. It had barely registered then, but now, as he leaned against the railing, it lingered in his thoughts. The storm clouds on the horizon threatened to sour the mood, but for now, the energy on board was upbeat. The new crew brought fresh energy to the long days, and the armed security team, a standard precaution in these pirate-prone waters, had given their standard safety briefing. The 5 men, decked out in tactical gear, looked intimidating but professional, reassuring the crew of their safety. Garrett's attention shifted to a group of newcomers gathered by the main deck crane. They were chatting animatedly, their laughter carrying over the breeze. He noted how some were pale, coughing into their sleeves or wiping their noses. It wasn't unusual for people to show up with colds or minor illnesses, especially after flights and tight quarters during transit. Still, a gnawing sense of unease settled in his stomach. He shook it off. Paranoia wouldn't do anyone any good. By nightfall, the atmosphere had shifted. The storm had rolled in with sudden ferocity, battering the Sentinel with wind and rain. Garrett had just settled into his small cabin, a sparse room with a bunk bed, a desk cluttered with maintenance manuals, and a single photograph of his sister pinned to the wall. He stared at the photo for a moment, thinking of home. The lights flickered, snapping him out of his thoughts, and moments later, the ship's comms went down. In the control room, attempts to re-establish communications with the mainland were proving futile. Storm's probably interfering with the signal, the chief officer said, his voice calm but clipped. Nothing we haven't dealt with before. Garrett wasn't convinced. Something about the storm felt wrong, almost malicious. He decided to head to the engine room to double-check the auxiliary systems. On his way, he passed the infirmary and paused when he heard muffled voices inside. "It's just the flu," one of the medics was saying. "We'll monitor them, but it's nothing to panic about." A deep cough followed, echoing ominously through the door. Garrett hesitated, then moved on. Flu outbreaks were common in enclosed spaces like the Sentinel, but this one seemed to spread faster. Too fast. 6 hours later, chaos erupted. Garrett was inspecting the generators when the alarms blared. Red lights flashed across the deck, and the ship's PA system crackled to life. "All crew, report to muster stations immediately." The captain's voice was sharp, edged with urgency. "This is not a drill." Garrett bolted, his heart hammering. On his way to the main deck, he encountered a scene that froze him in place. A crew member, one of the newcomers, lunged at another man, his face contorted in an expression of primal rage. Blood sprayed as the attacker's teeth sank into the victim's arm. "Hey!" Garrett shouted, instinctively grabbing a wrench from his tool belt. He swung it with all his strength, connecting with the attacker's head. The man collapsed, but to Garrett's horror, he started twitching almost immediately, as if he was trying to rise again. "What the hell is happening?" Garrett whispered to himself, backing away. He turned and sprinted toward the muster station, his mind racing. Whatever this was, it wasn't normal. It wasn't the flu. By the time Garrett reached the main deck, the outbreak had already begun to spread. Crew members were running in all directions, some screaming, others fighting off attackers with whatever tools they could grab. The armed security team was firing controlled bursts, but their shouts suggested they were quickly being overwhelmed. Garrett's gaze darted to the bridge. The captain was gesturing wildly, directing the remaining crew toward the citadel. The reinforced safe room could hold a significant portion of the crew, but with 200 people on board, not everyone would make it. "Get to the citadel!" someone screamed, yanking Garrett's arm. He followed the flow of panicked crew members toward the heavy reinforced door at the ship's core, the sounds of gunfire and screams echoing behind him. His heart sank as he realized that this was only the beginning. As he moved with the crowd, Garrett's thoughts raced. He'd always prided himself on staying calm under pressure, on finding solutions no matter how dire the problem. But this was something else entirely. For the first time in his career, he wasn't sure if he'd make it to the next sunrise. The reinforced steel door slammed shut behind Garrett with a deafening clang. Dozens of hands worked the mechanisms, manual levers and digital locks, to secure the barrier. When the last bolt clicked into place, a chilling silence fell over the room. Only the muffled sounds of chaos beyond the door remained, faint and intermittent, like the dying gasps of a world they had just escaped. Garrett stood by the entrance, his chest heaving as he tried to steady his breath. The citadel was nothing like he'd imagined. It wasn't just a room, it was a fortress. The walls were lined with thick, reinforced steel, layered with advanced composites designed to withstand explosive impacts and prolonged assaults. Airlocks connected the chamber to adjacent corridors, ensuring containment in case of a breach. Banks of monitors fed live footage from every critical point on the ship, offering a grim view of the chaos outside. The room itself was meticulously organized. Rows of shelves held crates of emergency rations, water filtration systems, and medical supplies. A smaller locked compartment contained a limited arsenal, pistols, rifles, and ammunition. At the far end of the space, a command station was equipped with high-frequency radios, though a blinking red light indicated they were offline for now. Ventilation systems hummed softly, filtering and recirculating the air to protect against external contaminants. 50 crew members huddled inside, their faces pale and drawn. Some were slumped against the walls, their eyes staring blankly ahead. Others whispered in hushed tones, their voices laced with fear. Among them were 2 members of the armed security team, their rifles clutched tightly as they surveyed the room. The sight of their weapons provided little comfort. Even they looked rattled. "All right, everyone, listen up." The captain's voice cut through the murmurs. Standing on a raised platform near the command station, he radiated a calm authority. "We are in an emergency situation. This citadel is designed to protect us, but it's not invincible. We need to work together if we're going to survive. That means staying organized and following instructions." Garrett's gaze wandered to the monitors. One feed showed the main deck, where figures, crew members turned attackers, stumbled aimlessly. Their movements were erratic, unnatural, as though their bodies were controlled by something other than their own will. He shuddered and turned his attention back to the captain. "We'll set up shifts for monitoring the cameras and maintaining the Citadel's systems," the captain continued. "Anyone with technical or medical skills, come forward. We need all hands on deck." Garrett stepped forward without hesitation. "I'm a mechanical engineer. I know the ship's systems inside out." The captain nodded. "Good. You'll assist Carter in securing the ventilation systems and ensuring the power supply remains stable." Carter, one of the security team members, gave Garrett a curt nod. Together, they moved toward a terminal displaying diagnostic data. As they worked, Carter spoke in a low voice. "You've been on this ship a while, haven't you?" 3 years, Garrett replied, his hands deftly navigating the controls. "Never seen anything like this, though." Carter grunted. "None of us have, but we'll get through it. Stick to what you know and don't let fear take over." The hours passed in a blur of activity. Garrett helped reinforce weak points in the Citadel's defenses, distributed supplies, and monitored the camera feeds. Each task provided a brief respite from the gnawing dread that threatened to consume him. But as the night wore on, the reality of their predicament became harder to ignore. The infected were spreading rapidly, their numbers growing with every passing hour. The ship, once a bastion of safety and routine, had become a floating nightmare. And as secure as the Citadel seemed, Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that their sanctuary was only temporary. Tension hung thick in the Citadel as the crew settled into a grim routine. Garrett paced between the command station and the diagnostic terminals, his mind racing as he reviewed the data on the monitors. The infected were spreading with alarming speed, their numbers swelling as more of the ship fell to chaos. Every passing hour brought new challenges, and Garrett knew that their safety was tenuous at best. The captain stood at the center of the room, issuing orders and coordinating shifts. "We need eyes on every corridor leading to this Citadel," he said, his tone firm. "If there's even the slightest breach, I want to know about it immediately." Carter nodded and turned to Garrett. "You're with me. Let's reinforce the airlocks on the west side." Garrett followed him through the Citadel's cramped corridors, his heart pounding with every step. The air was stifling, the weight of their predicament pressing down on him like a vice. When they reached the west airlock, Carter handed him a wrench and pointed to a series of bolts along the frame. "Tighten these down," he said. "We can't afford any weak points." As Garrett worked, he glanced at the monitor mounted above the airlock. The feed showed the corridor outside, where shadows flitted past the camera in eerie silence. He shivered and focused on his task, his hands trembling slightly as he tightened the bolts. "Do you think we'll make it?" he asked quietly, breaking the tense silence. Carter paused, his expression unreadable. "We don't have a choice," he said. "We either make it or we don't, but I'm not giving up." Garrett nodded, his resolve hardening. He couldn't afford to lose hope. Not now. They had to find a way to survive. Suddenly, the monitor above them flickered, and a new figure appeared on the screen. It was a crew member, but something was wrong. The man's movements were erratic, his limbs jerking unnaturally as he stumbled down the corridor. His eyes were vacant, his face contorted in a grotesque snarl. "We've got a problem," Carter muttered, reaching for his radio. "Captain, we've got activity near the west airlock, requesting backup." The captain's voice crackled over the radio. "Acknowledged. Hold your position. We're sending reinforcements." Garrett's grip tightened on the wrench as he watched the figure on the monitor. The man was moving closer, his steps uneven but purposeful. Behind him, more shadows emerged, their distorted shapes filling the corridor. Panic surged in Garrett's chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Carter glanced at him, his expression grim. "We hold the line." The first infected reached the airlock, slamming against the reinforced door with unnatural strength. The impact reverberated through the Citadel, drawing the attention of the crew inside. Garrett and Carter braced themselves, their eyes locked on the monitor as more infected joined the assault. The reinforcements arrived moments later, their weapons at the ready. One of them, a wiry man named Delgado, took position beside Carter. "What's the situation?" he asked. "We've got a breach forming," Carter replied. "Hold them off while we secure the airlock." Delgado nodded and raised his rifle, firing controlled bursts through the narrow viewport in the door. The gunfire echoed through the corridor, drowning out the guttural snarls of the infected. Garrett worked frantically to reinforce the airlock, his hands slick with sweat as he tightened the final bolts. "That should hold," he said, stepping back. Carter nodded, but his expression remained tense. "Let's hope so." The assault on the airlock continued for what felt like an eternity, the infected throwing themselves against the door with relentless fury. Delgado and the other reinforcements held their ground, their weapons blazing as they fought to keep the creatures at bay. Finally, after what felt like hours, the attackers began to thin out, their numbers dwindling as the crew's efforts took their toll. When the last infected fell, the corridor was silent once more. Garrett slumped against the wall, his body trembling with exhaustion. He glanced at Carter, who was breathing heavily but still standing strong. "We did it," Garrett said, his voice barely audible. Carter nodded, his expression somber. For now. The victory was short-lived. As the crew regrouped and assessed the damage, the reality of their situation became painfully clear. The Citadel had held, but the ship was far from secure, and with every passing moment, the infected grew stronger, their numbers swelling as the virus spread unchecked. Garrett stared at the monitor long after the others had returned to their posts. The feed from the west airlock showed the carnage left behind, bodies twisted and broken, blood pooling on the floor in stark contrast to the sterile white walls. Yet even in death, the infected looked menacing. Their expressions, frozen in grotesque snarls, seemed to promise that this was far from over. He turned to Carter, who was methodically cleaning his rifle at the command station. "What do you think caused this?" Garrett asked. "I mean, how does something like this even happen?" Carter didn't look up. "Doesn't matter how it started," he said. "What matters is stopping it." Garrett frowned, but let the matter drop. Carter wasn't one for speculation, and right now, they had bigger problems. The captain was calling for another meeting, and Garrett knew it wouldn't be good news. The crew gathered around the command station, their faces drawn and pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. The captain's voice was steady, but there was no mistaking the gravity of his words. "We've lost contact with the engine room," he said. "The cameras show no signs of life, and we have to assume the worst. Without the engines, we're dead in the water. That means we need volunteers to go down there and assess the situation." A heavy silence fell over the room. Garrett felt his stomach twist. The engine room was a labyrinth of tight corridors and towering machinery, and it was likely crawling with infected. Volunteering for this mission was as good as a death sentence. "I'll go," Garrett said, surprising even himself. He wasn't sure why he'd spoken up. Maybe it was guilt or a desperate need to feel useful. Whatever the reason, the words were out, and there was no taking them back. The captain nodded, his expression unreadable. "Thank you, Garrett. Carter, you'll go with him. Delgado, you're in charge of their escort." Carter gave a curt nod, while Delgado muttered something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. The three men began preparing for the mission, checking their equipment and reviewing the layout of the engine room on a tablet. Garrett tried not to think about the odds of coming back alive. The descent into the bowels of the ship was nerve-wracking. The corridors were eerily quiet, the only sounds their own breathing and the faint hum of the ship's systems. Delgado led the way, his rifle raised and his eyes scanning every shadow. Carter brought up the rear, his expression unreadable as always. Garrett was sandwiched between them, clutching a crowbar he'd taken from the Citadel's supply room. It felt woefully inadequate. As they approached the engine room, the stench hit them first, a sickly sweet odor of decay and rot that made Garrett gag. Delgado motioned for them to stop and crouched low, peering around the corner. He held up 3 fingers, then pointed down the hall. Garrett followed his gaze and saw them. 3 infected, shuffling aimlessly among the towering machinery. Their clothes were torn and bloodied, their movements jerky and uncoordinated. But what struck Garrett most was their silence. They didn't growl or snarl like the ones at the airlock. They simply wandered, as if waiting for something. Delgado signaled for them to move forward. The plan was simple: take them out quietly and avoid drawing attention. Garrett's heart hammered in his chest as he gripped his crowbar and crept closer. He'd never killed anything before, let alone a person, or what used to be a person. But there was no room for hesitation. Delgado struck first, his knife plunging into the base of one infected skull. The creature crumpled without a sound. Carter followed suit, dispatching the second with brutal efficiency. That left the third for Garrett. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, and that was all it took. The infected turned, its lifeless eyes locking onto his. It lunged, and Garrett swung the crowbar with all his strength. The metal connected with a sickening crack, and the creature collapsed at his feet, twitching violently before going still. Garrett stood there, his chest heaving and his hands trembling. Carter clapped him on the shoulder. "Not bad," he said. "But next time, don't wait." They continued deeper into the engine room, navigating the maze of pipes and catwalks. The infected they'd seen so far were just the beginning. The farther they went, the more they encountered, each fight pushing them closer to exhaustion. By the time they reached the control panel, Garrett's arms felt like lead, and his clothes were soaked with sweat and blood. Delgado inspected the panel, muttering curses under his breath. "The main power's offline," he said. "We'll need to restart it manually." Garrett groaned. The manual restart involved venturing even deeper into the ship, to a section that hadn't been cleared yet. But there was no other choice. Without power, the Citadel wouldn't hold for long. "Let's move," Carter said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Garrett nodded and followed, gripping his crowbar tightly. The fight was far from over. The corridors leading away from the engine room were narrower than Garrett had expected. Claustrophobic, even. The walls seemed to close in on him, the dim emergency lighting casting long, distorted shadows. His grip on the crowbar tightened, his palms slick with sweat despite the cool air. Carter led the way, his movements steady and deliberate, while Delgado covered their rear, his rifle raised and ready. "Stay close," Carter whispered, glancing back at Garrett. "We're in their territory now." Garrett nodded, his throat too dry to respond. The stench of decay grew stronger with every step, a putrid reminder of the carnage they'd left behind in the engine room. He tried to focus on the task ahead, to ignore the gnawing fear that clawed at the edges of his mind. They needed to restart the main power system. Without it, the Citadel, and everyone inside, was as good as dead. The corridor opened into a small maintenance room, the walls lined with rusted tools and spare parts. Carter held up a hand, signaling them to stop. He scanned the room with his flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness. Garrett followed his gaze, his eyes darting to every shadow, every crevice. "Clear," Carter said, motioning them forward. "Let's keep moving." They pressed on, the tension in the air thick enough to choke. The ship's deep groans and creaks filled the silence, each sound setting Garrett's nerves on edge. Then came the first jump scare. A loud crash echoed from behind, followed by the sound of metal scraping against metal. Garrett whipped around, his heart pounding in his chest. Delgado's flashlight beam darted across the corridor, landing on a fallen pipe. "Just the ship settling," Delgado muttered, though his voice was tight. "Let's keep moving." Garrett exhaled shakily, his grip on the crowbar tightening. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The next encounter came as they entered a cavernous storage bay. The room was massive, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. Rows of crates and containers formed a maze of shadows, the perfect hiding spots for anything. Carter motioned for them to spread out, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. "Stay sharp," he said. "They could be anywhere." Garrett moved cautiously, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. His breathing was shallow, each step feeling louder than it should. He turned a corner and froze. There, between two crates, was an infected. It stood motionless, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Blood dripped from its gaping mouth, pooling at its feet. Garrett swallowed hard, raising his crowbar. The infected didn't move. For a moment, he thought it might be dead, truly dead. But then its head snapped toward him, its bloodshot eyes locking onto his. It lunged. Garrett swung the crowbar with everything he had, the metal connecting with the creature's skull with a sickening crack. The force of the blow sent it sprawling to the ground, but it didn't stay down. It scrambled to its feet, its movements jerky and erratic. Garrett swung again, this time aiming for the side of its head. The impact sent it crashing into a crate, where it lay still. "Garrett, you good?" Carter's voice cut through the adrenaline-fueled haze. "Yeah," Garrett said, his voice trembling. "I got it." "Good," Carter said, stepping into view. "Because we've got company." Garrett turned to see 3 more infected shambling toward them from the far end of the bay. Delgado opened fire, the sharp crack of his rifle echoing through the room. One infected went down, then another. The third broke into a sprint, its guttural growls growing louder as it closed the distance. Carter stepped forward, his knife flashing in the dim light. He met the creature head-on, driving the blade into its chest before twisting and pulling it free. The infected collapsed, twitching violently before going still. We need to move, Carter said, wiping the blood from his knife. This place isn't safe. The next corridor was even darker, the emergency lights flickering weakly. Garrett's nerves were frayed, every sound making him jump. Delgado led the way, his rifle raised, while Carter stayed close to Garrett's side. "You're doing good," Carter said quietly. "Just stay focused." Garrett nodded, though he didn't feel particularly good. His arms ached, and his head was pounding from the tension, but he kept moving, one step at a time. They reached a T-junction, the corridors branching off in opposite directions. Delgado paused, consulting the map on his tablet. "Left takes us to the auxiliary control room," he said. "Right leads to the maintenance shafts. Which way?" Carter considered for a moment. "Auxiliary control room. We need to get the power back online." Delgado nodded and took the lead. As they turned the corner, a deafening roar filled the air. Garrett barely had time to react before something massive barreled into Delgado, sending him crashing into the wall. His rifle clattered to the ground as the infected, this one larger and more muscular than the others, pinned him against the wall, its jaws snapping inches from his face. Carter lunged forward, his knife flashing as he drove it into the creature's side. It roared in pain, releasing Delgado and turning its attention to Carter. Garrett hesitated, fear rooting him in place. Then he saw the creature rear back, its claws poised to strike. "No!" Garrett shouted, charging forward. He swung the crowbar with all his strength, the impact sending the creature staggering back. It snarled, its bloodshot eyes locking onto him. Carter seized the opportunity, driving his knife into its neck. The creature collapsed, its body twitching before going still. Delgado groaned, clutching his side as he pushed himself to his feet. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice strained. "You okay?" Carter asked, his eyes scanning Delgado for injuries. "I'll live," Delgado said, though he didn't look so sure. "Let's keep moving." The auxiliary control room was in shambles. Wires dangled from the ceiling and broken panels littered the floor. The air was thick with the smell of burnt electronics. Carter swore under his breath as he surveyed the damage. "This is worse than I thought," he said. "Garrett, see if you can get anything working." Garrett nodded, stepping carefully over the debris. He approached the main control panel, his heart sinking at the sight of the mangled wires. He wasn't sure if he could fix this, but he had to try. He set to work, his hands moving quickly despite their trembling. Behind him, Carter and Delgado kept watch, their weapons at the ready. The room was eerily quiet, the only sounds the faint hum of the ship and Garrett's labored breathing. Then came the jump scare. A vent cover crashed to the floor, the sudden noise making Garrett yelp. He spun around, his crowbar raised, just as an infected dropped from the ceiling. It landed on Carter, knocking him to the ground. Delgado fired, but the shot went wide, the bullet sparking off the metal floor. Garrett didn't think. He charged forward, swinging the crowbar with all his strength. The metal connected with the creature's head, the impact sending it sprawling. Carter scrambled to his feet, his knife flashing as he finished it off. "Nice work," Carter said, breathing heavily. "Thanks," Garrett said, his voice shaking. "Let's just get this done." It took nearly an hour, but Garrett managed to jury-rig a solution. The lights flickered to life, and the hum of machinery filled the room. He exhaled in relief, stepping back from the panel. "Power's back online," he said. Carter clapped him on the shoulder. "Good work. Let's get back to the Citadel." The journey back was no less harrowing. The infected seemed to be growing more aggressive, their numbers increasing with every turn. By the time they reached the Citadel, Garrett was running on pure adrenaline. He stumbled through the heavy steel door, collapsing onto the floor as it slammed shut behind them. "You did good out there," Carter said, helping him to his feet. "Thanks," Garrett said, though he didn't feel particularly good. The images of the infected, their snarling faces, their twisted bodies, were burned into his mind. He wasn't sure if he'd ever be able to forget them. The captain approached, his expression grim. "Did you get the power back?" "Yeah," Garrett said, "but it's a mess down there. We're not out of the woods yet." The captain nodded. "Good work. Get some rest. We'll need you again soon." Garrett nodded, though the thought of rest seemed impossible. He made his way to a corner of the Citadel, slumping against the wall. His body ached, his mind racing with everything they'd been through. He knew this was far from over. The fight for survival was just beginning. The citadel was quieter now, but the silence brought no comfort. It was the type of silence that pressed against your ears, amplifying the sound of your own heartbeat. Garrett sat slumped against the wall, his muscles aching from the earlier mission. The cold steel of the citadel floor seeped through his clothes, sending an occasional shiver up his spine. Rest seemed impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, the grotesque images of the infected clawed at his mind. Carter approached, his face shadowed in the dim emergency lighting. "Garrett," he said, his voice low but firm, "we need you for another run. There's been a breach in Storage Bay 3. Garrett's stomach churned. He hadn't even had time to process the last mission, let alone prepare for another. But he pushed himself to his feet, gripping his crowbar tightly. "I'm ready," he lied. The corridors leading to Storage Bay 3 were darker than Garrett remembered. The flickering lights cast distorted shadows, making it impossible to distinguish reality from his imagination. Every step echoed ominously, the sound bouncing off the narrow walls. Delgado took the lead this time, his rifle aimed forward, while Carter covered the rear. Garrett was sandwiched between them, his grip on the crowbar so tight that his knuckles ached. The smell hit them first, a rancid mix of decay and coppery blood. Garrett gagged, covering his nose with his sleeve. "They're close," Carter murmured. Delgado nodded, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The beam landed on a trail of blood smeared along the floor, leading deeper into the bay. "Stay sharp," Delgado said. They moved cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the blood-streaked floor. The air grew heavier with each step, thick with an unshakable dread. Garrett's ears strained for any sound, but the silence was deafening. Then, faintly, came the first noise, a wet, squelching sound that sent a chill down his spine. "What is that?" Garrett whispered. Delgado didn't answer. He raised his rifle, signaling them to stop. The squelching grew louder, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. Garrett's heart pounded as he peered into the darkness, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. Suddenly, something moved. A shadow darted across the edge of the flashlight's beam, too fast to fully see. Delgado swung his rifle toward it, but before he could fire, a figure lunged out of the darkness. It was one of the infected, but its appearance was more grotesque than any they had encountered before. Its flesh hung in ragged strips, exposing sinew and bone. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, filled with a malevolent hunger. Delgado fired, the gunshots deafening in the confined space. The bullets tore into the creature, but it didn't stop. It lunged at him, claws outstretched. Garrett reacted on instinct, swinging his crowbar with all his strength. The metal connected with the creature's skull, producing a sickening crunch. It collapsed, twitching violently before going still. Garrett stood over it, his chest heaving, the crowbar slick with blood. "What the hell was that?" he gasped. "They're changing," Carter said grimly. "We need to move." The storage bay was a scene from a nightmare. The massive space, once filled with neatly stacked crates, was now a chaotic mess. Blood and viscera coated the floor, and the stench was overwhelming. Garrett tried to focus, but his eyes kept drifting to the bodies scattered throughout the room. Some were crew members, their lifeless eyes staring into the void. Others were infected, their mutilated forms barely recognizable as human. "Fan out," Carter ordered. "We need to secure the area." Garrett nodded, forcing himself to move. He stepped over the remains of a crew member, trying not to look too closely. His flashlight beam swept across the room, revealing more carnage. Then, in the far corner, he saw movement. "Carter," he whispered. "Over there." Carter and Delgado joined him, their weapons ready. The movement came again, and this time Garrett saw it clearly. A small group of infected, 3 or 4, huddled together, their grotesque forms illuminated by the flashlight. They were feasting on something, their snarls and wet chewing sounds filling the room. "Take them out," Carter said. Delgado fired the first shot, the sharp crack of his rifle breaking the tension. The infected reacted instantly, turning toward them with guttural roars. Garrett swung his crowbar as one charged at him, the impact sending it crashing to the floor. Another lunged at Carter, who dispatched it with a swift knife strike to the neck. Delgado fired again, dropping the last 2. The room fell silent once more, save for their ragged breathing. "Is that all of them?" Garrett asked, his voice shaking. Carter scanned the room, his expression grim. "For now, let's finish the sweep." As they moved deeper into the bay, the sense of unease grew. The flickering lights cast eerie shadows, and every sound seemed amplified. Garrett's nerves were frayed, his body on edge. Then out of nowhere came the sound of metal scraping against metal. "What was that?" Delgado asked, his voice tight. Before anyone could answer, a massive crate toppled over, crashing to the floor with a deafening clang. From behind it emerged another infected, but this one was different. It was larger, its muscles bulging unnaturally. Its skin was a patchwork of scars and open wounds, and its eyes burned with rage. "Get back!" Carter shouted. The creature roared, the sound reverberating through the bay. It charged at them with terrifying speed, its heavy footsteps shaking the floor. Delgado fired, but the bullets seemed to do little more than enrage it. The creature swiped at him, sending him sprawling. Garrett felt a surge of panic but forced himself to act. He swung his crowbar at the creature's leg, hoping to slow it down. The metal connected, and the creature stumbled, letting out an ear-splitting roar. Carter seized the opportunity, plunging his knife into its side. The creature thrashed, knocking Carter to the ground. "Garrett, move!" Carter shouted. Garrett dodged as the creature lunged at him, its claws raking the air inches from his face. He swung the crowbar again, this time aiming for its head. The impact dazed the creature, giving Delgado time to recover. He grabbed his rifle and fired a shot directly into its eye. The creature let out a final guttural roar before collapsing in a heap. They stood over it, their breaths ragged. The room was silent once more, but the tension lingered. "They're getting stronger," Carter said, his voice grim. "We need to report this to the captain." The walk back to the Citadel was somber. Garrett's body ached, and his mind was a whirlwind of fear and exhaustion. The infected were changing, becoming more dangerous, and with each encounter, the reality of their situation became harder to ignore. The ship was no longer a place of safety. It was a battlefield, and survival was far from guaranteed. When they reached the Citadel, the captain was waiting. His expression darkened as Carter explained what they had encountered. "This changes everything," the captain said. "We'll need to revise our strategy. The Citadel won't hold forever." Garrett sank into a chair, the weight of the day finally catching up to him. He closed his eyes, but the images of the infected were still there, burned into his mind. He knew he couldn't rest, not yet. The fight was far from over. The next morning, the captain called a meeting. The crew gathered in the Citadel, their faces pale and weary. Garrett stood in the back, his crowbar resting against his leg. The captain's voice was steady, but the gravity of his words was unmistakable. "We've lost control of the lower decks," he said. "The infected are spreading faster than we anticipated. If we don't find a way to contain this, the entire ship will be overrun." A heavy silence fell over the room. Garrett felt a knot form in his stomach. The thought of the infected breaching the Citadel was almost too much to bear, but he knew they couldn't give up. Not now. "What's the plan?" Carter asked. The captain's gaze swept over the crew. "We'll need to seal off the lower decks completely. It's a risky move, but it's our only chance. Garrett, Carter, Delgado, I'll need you to lead the mission." Garrett's heart sank, but he nodded. He couldn't let fear control him. Not anymore. "Let's do this," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. The fight for survival was far from over, but Garrett was determined to see it through. Whatever it took, he would keep fighting. For the crew, for himself, for the faint hope that they might make it out alive. The atmosphere in the Citadel was suffocating. The crew's dwindling numbers weighed heavily on everyone, and the air seemed thick with unspoken fears. Garrett stood near the main console, watching Carter and Delgado argue quietly with the captain. Their voices were low, but the tension in their postures was clear. Everyone knew the plan to seal off the lower decks was their last shot, but nobody wanted to admit the odds were slim. Delgado, pale but determined, leaned against the console. His bandaged side, still throbbing from their last mission, made him wince as he shifted. Garrett noted the beads of sweat on Delgado's forehead and the slight tremor in his hands. Something wasn't right. "Delgado," Garrett said softly, stepping closer. "You okay?" Delgado shot him a weak grin. "Just a scratch," he said, waving it off. "I've been through worse." Garrett frowned but didn't press further. There wasn't time to dwell on suspicions. The infected weren't going to wait for them to gather their courage. The lower decks were a labyrinth of narrow corridors and cramped compartments, a stark contrast to the relatively open spaces of the citadel. The air was damp and reeked of mildew and rot. Every step felt heavier, every shadow more oppressive. Garrett clutched his crowbar, his knuckles white as he followed Carter and Delgado through the maze-like halls. "Stick together," Carter said, his voice barely above a whisper. "These halls amplify sound. We don't want to attract more than we can handle." They moved in silence, their footsteps muted by the blood-stained floors. The emergency lights flickered sporadically, casting eerie shadows that played tricks on the mind. Garrett's ears strained for any sound, but the silence was deafening. A loud bang echoed from somewhere ahead, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal clanging against metal. Everyone froze. "What was that?" Garrett whispered, his heart pounding. "Stay sharp," Carter said, motioning for them to move forward. Delgado raised his rifle, his breathing labored but steady. As they rounded a corner, the source of the noise became clear. A group of infected was clawing at a heavy steel door, their grotesque forms illuminated by the flickering lights. Their growls and snarls reverberated through the corridor, sending shivers down Garrett's spine. "Take them out," Carter ordered. Delgado opened fire, the sharp cracks of his rifle shattering the silence. The infected turned, their bloodshot eyes locking onto the group. Garrett braced himself as one of them charged, its mangled limbs flailing as it closed the distance. He swung his crowbar, the impact sending the creature sprawling to the ground. Another infected lunged at Carter, who dispatched it with a swift knife strike. Delgado continued firing, his shots precise despite his visibly deteriorating condition. The last infected fell, its guttural growl fading into silence. Garrett exhaled shakily, his hands trembling. "That can't be all of them," he said, his voice barely audible. "It's not," Carter replied grimly. "Let's keep moving." As they pressed deeper into the lower decks, the air grew colder, and the sense of unease intensified. The walls seemed to close in, the narrow corridors feeling more like a tomb with every step. Delgado lagged slightly behind, his breathing ragged. "Delgado, you sure you're good?" Garrett asked, unable to ignore the obvious any longer. "I said I'm fine." Delgado snapped, his voice sharper than intended. He took a deep breath, softening his tone. "Let's just get this over with." Garrett exchanged a worried glance with Carter, who nodded subtly. They couldn't afford to lose anyone, but it was clear Delgado was struggling. They reached a large storage room, the ceiling high enough to make their flashlights seem dim. Crates were stacked haphazardly, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Carter motioned for them to spread out, and Garrett hesitated before moving toward the nearest stack of crates. The sound of something wet and heavy dropping to the floor made him freeze. He turned slowly, his flashlight beam sweeping across the room. It landed on a body sprawled on the ground, its chest rising and falling shallowly. "Carter," Garrett called, his voice trembling. "We've got a live one." Carter and Delgado joined him, their weapons ready. The figure on the floor groaned, its movements weak and uncoordinated. It was a crew member, their uniform torn and bloodied. They looked up, their eyes glassy and unfocused. "Help, me," the crew member rasped, their voice barely audible. "We don't have time for this," Carter said, his tone harsh. "They're turning." Garrett hesitated. "We can't just leave them." Before anyone could respond, the crew member convulsed violently, their body twisting and contorting in unnatural ways. Their groans turned to guttural snarls, and their eyes rolled back into their head. Then, with a sudden burst of strength, they lunged at Garrett. Garrett barely had time to react, stumbling backward as the infected crew member swiped at him. Carter fired, but the shot missed, ricocheting off the wall. Delgado raised his rifle, his hands shaking, but before he could fire, the infected pounced on him. The chaos was instantaneous. Delgado screamed as the infected sank its teeth into his shoulder, blood spurting from the wound. Carter pulled the creature off, stabbing it repeatedly until it stopped moving. Garrett helped Delgado to his feet, his heart racing. "We need to get him back to the Citadel," Garrett said urgently, his voice shaking. "No," Delgado said through gritted teeth. "You can't risk it. You know what happens." "Shut up," Carter snapped. "We're not leaving you." But Delgado's condition deteriorated rapidly. His skin turned pale, and his breathing grew more labored with each passing minute. By the time they reached the corridor leading back to the Citadel, he could barely stand. "We're almost there," Garrett said, trying to sound reassuring, but deep down, he knew the truth. Delgado collapsed, his body convulsing violently. Carter and Garrett knelt beside him, their expressions grim. "Delgado," Carter said, his voice breaking, "stay with us." Delgado's eyes opened, but they were no longer his. They were bloodshot and filled with rage. He let out a guttural snarl, lunging at Carter with terrifying speed. Garrett reacted instinctively, swinging his crowbar. The impact sent Delgado sprawling, but he got back up almost immediately. Carter fired, the bullet tearing through Delgado's chest. He fell again, twitching violently before going still. The silence that followed was deafening. Garrett stared at Delgado's lifeless body, his hands trembling. "Let's go," Carter said quietly, his voice filled with grief. "We need to seal the lower decks." The loss of Delgado cast a shadow over the rest of the mission. Garrett and Carter moved through the corridors like ghosts, their movements mechanical. The infected seemed more aggressive now, their snarls echoing through the halls as they closed in from all sides. As they reached the final control panel, the infected swarmed. Dozens of them poured into the corridor, their twisted forms illuminated by the flickering lights. Garrett and Carter fought desperately, their weapons flashing in the dim light. For every infected they took down, 2 more seemed to appear. "We're not going to make it," Garrett shouted, his voice filled with panic. "Yes, we are," Carter snapped. "Keep fighting." Garrett swung his crowbar, the impact sending an infected crashing into the wall. Carter fired his rifle, the shots echoing like thunder. The floor was slick with blood, the air filled with the stench of death. Garrett's arms ached, but he kept swinging, his adrenaline fueling him. Finally, the infected began to thin out. Garrett and Carter stood back to back, their breaths ragged. The corridor was silent once more, save for their labored breathing. "Let's seal it," Carter said, his voice hoarse. Garrett nodded, moving to the control panel. His hands trembled as he activated the lockdown sequence. The heavy steel doors slammed shut, sealing off the lower decks. The sound echoed through the ship, a grim reminder of the lives lost to contain the outbreak. When they returned to the Citadel, the crew's faces were a mix of relief and despair. The lower decks were sealed, but at what cost? Garrett sank into a chair, his body heavy with exhaustion. He couldn't shake the image of Delgado's lifeless eyes, the sound of his snarls as he turned. "We did what we had to," Carter said, sitting beside him. "It doesn't get easier, but it's the only way." Garrett nodded, though his heart felt like it was breaking. The fight for survival was far from over, and the losses would only continue to mount. But for now, they had bought themselves a little more time. And in this hellish nightmare, time was the most precious resource they had. The Citadel felt colder after Delgado's death. His absence weighed heavily on Garrett and the remaining crew. Despite sealing the lower decks, everyone knew the infected would find another way. The ship wasn't built to be a fortress. It was a floating death trap, and Garrett could feel the walls closing in. The remaining crew gathered in the central hub. Carter stood at the console, his expression grim as he briefed them on their next steps. The captain had insisted they inspect the upper levels for signs of infected breaches, and while the crew silently disagreed, no one dared say it aloud. Among the group was Elise, the ship's medic. Her calm demeanor had been a source of reassurance, but even she looked frazzled now. Her dark hair was pulled into a messy bun, and her hands trembled as she loaded her medical bag with supplies. "We stick together," Carter said firmly, his gaze moving from one person to the next. "If we see signs of a breach, we fall back immediately. No heroics." Garrett nodded, clutching his crowbar. Elise strapped on her medical bag, her lips pressed into a thin line. Beside her stood Andre, the ship's engineer, who clutched a wrench so tightly his knuckles were white. "We're ready," Elise said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The group moved cautiously through the upper levels, the emergency lighting casting everything in eerie red hues. The corridors were silent, save for the occasional creak of the ship's structure. The air smelled of oil and something metallic that made Garrett's stomach churn. "Stay close," Carter reminded them as they entered a large observation deck. The glass windows showed the vast expanse of the ocean, black and endless. The storm that had knocked out communications earlier had left the waves churning violently below. Andre moved toward a panel by the windows, examining the systems. "Looks like the power here's holding steady," he said, his voice tinged with relief. Elise turned to Garrett, her voice low. "How are you holding up?" He hesitated. "I'm alive," he said simply. He didn't know how else to describe the cocktail of fear and exhaustion coursing through him. "Alive is good," Elise said, managing a weak smile. Their brief moment of reprieve shattered when a loud crash echoed from the corridor they'd just left. Everyone froze, their breaths hitching. Carter raised his rifle, motioning for silence. The sound of dragging footsteps followed, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. "Get ready," Carter whispered. The first infected stumbled into view, its body twisted and grotesque, its jaw hung at an unnatural angle, and its bloodshot eyes locked onto the group. Behind it, more infected emerged, their snarls growing louder as they approached. "Fire!" Carter shouted, his rifle cracking as he took the first shot. The corridor erupted into chaos as the group fought desperately to hold back the swarm. Andre swung his wrench, the heavy metal connecting with sickening thuds. Garrett's crowbar felt like an extension of his arm as he struck out at anything that came too close. Elise stayed back, her knife drawn but unused. She focused on keeping an eye on the others, ready to jump in if anyone fell. But the infected were relentless. For every one they killed, 2 more seemed to take its place. "We can't hold them here," Garrett shouted, his voice barely audible over the snarls and gunfire. "Fall back," Carter ordered. They retreated into the observation deck, slamming the door shut behind them. Carter and Garrett shoved a heavy console in front of it, creating a makeshift barricade. The infected pounded against the metal, their snarls muffled but persistent. "Everyone okay?" Carter asked, his breathing heavy. "I'm fine," Elise said, checking her supplies. "Andre?" Andre nodded, though his face was pale. "I'm good, just need a minute." Garrett noticed the gash on Andre's arm, blood seeping through his sleeve. "Andre, you're hurt," he said, stepping closer. "It's nothing," Andre said quickly, pulling his arm away. "Just a scratch." Elise frowned, reaching for her bag. "Let me see it." "It's fine," Andre snapped, his voice rising. "I said it's nothing." Everyone stared at him, the tension in the room thickening. Elise exchanged a worried glance with Garrett, but she didn't push further. The pounding on the door grew louder, and Carter motioned for everyone to focus. "We need to move," Carter said. "This barricade won't hold forever." They decided to head to the communications array, hoping to re-establish contact with the mainland. The corridor leading there was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the ship's systems. Garrett stayed close to Elise, his eyes scanning every shadow for movement. Andre lagged behind, his steps unsteady. Garrett glanced back, noting the sweat on Andre's brow and the way he clutched his arm. "You sure you're okay?" he asked. Andre nodded but didn't speak. Garrett's stomach churned. He didn't want to think about what might happen if Andre's wound wasn't just a scratch. As they neared the communications array, Andre stumbled, nearly falling. Elise caught him, her expression shifting from concern to alarm. "Andre, you're burning up," she said, pressing a hand to his forehead. "It's nothing," Andre mumbled, his voice slurred. "Just tired." Carter stopped, turning to face them. "We don't have time for this. If he's infected—" "I'm not infected," Andre shouted, his voice echoing through the corridor. "I just need a minute." Before anyone could respond, Andre doubled over, groaning in pain. His body convulsed violently, and he collapsed to the floor. Elise knelt beside him, her hands trembling. "Andre, stay with me," she said, her voice breaking. Andre's eyes snapped open, but they were no longer his. Bloodshot and wild, they locked onto Elise. He let out a guttural snarl, his body twisting as he lunged at her. "Elise, move!" Carter shouted. Elise scrambled back as Andre lashed out, his movements jerky and unnatural. Garrett swung his crowbar, the impact sending Andre sprawling. But he didn't stay down. He turned on Garrett, snarling as he charged again. Carter fired, the bullet tearing through Andre's chest. He collapsed, twitching violently before going still. The silence that followed was deafening. Elise stared at Andre's lifeless body, her hands covering her mouth. "I could have helped him," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "No, you couldn't," Carter said, his voice firm but not unkind. He was gone the moment he turned. Garrett placed a hand on Elise's shoulder, unsure of what to say. The loss of Andre hit them all hard, but there was no time to grieve. The infected would be on them soon. The communications array was in shambles. Wires dangled from the ceiling, and the console was covered in blood. Garrett's stomach sank as he surveyed the damage. "Can we fix it?" Elise asked, her voice shaky. Carter shook his head. "Not in time. We need to fall back to the Citadel." Garrett hesitated, his gaze lingering on the broken console. Every step they took felt like they were delaying the inevitable. The infected were getting smarter, stronger, and the crew was running out of options. As they made their way back, the infected swarmed again. The corridors were a maze of snarls and blood as they fought their way through. Elise screamed as one of the infected grabbed her, its claws raking across her arm. Garrett swung his crowbar, the impact sending the creature crashing into the wall. "Go!" Carter shouted, firing his rifle as he covered their retreat. They reached the Citadel, slamming the heavy steel door shut behind them. The sound of the infected pounding against it echoed through the space. Carter locked the door, his hands shaking. "Is everyone okay?" he asked, turning to the group. Elise clutched her arm, blood seeping through her fingers. "It's not deep," she said, her voice trembling. Garrett helped her to a chair, his heart pounding. The Citadel felt smaller now, the walls pressing in as the infected continued their relentless assault. The crew was dwindling, and Garrett couldn't shake the feeling that their time was running out. "We'll make it," Carter said, though his voice lacked conviction. "We have to." Garrett wasn't so sure, but he gripped his crowbar tightly, ready for whatever came next. The fight wasn't over, not yet. The Citadel was no longer a sanctuary. The pounding of the infected against the steel doors was relentless, an unyielding reminder that their time was running out. Garrett sat on the floor, his back against the cold metal wall, staring blankly at the flickering emergency lights. Every sound seemed amplified in the silence between attacks, the creaks of the ship a haunting echo of its slow descent into chaos. Carter stood at the control panel, his hands resting on the edges as he leaned forward, his face grim. Elise was patching up the claw marks on her arm, her movements mechanical. The remaining crew members were scattered around the room, their faces pale and hollow. There were so few of them left now. "We can't stay here," Carter said, breaking the silence. His voice was low, but it carried the weight of the situation. "The Citadel won't hold. We need to find another way." "Another way?" Garrett asked, his voice hoarse. "To where? This ship is a tomb." Carter didn't respond immediately. He stared at the screen in front of him, the layout of the ship glowing faintly in the dim light. "There's the lifeboat deck," he said finally. "We can make a run for it, get off the ship." "And go where?" Elise asked, her tone sharp. "We're in the middle of the ocean. Even if we make it to the lifeboats, we'll be stranded." "Better stranded than torn apart," Carter said. Garrett exchanged a look with Elise. She was pale, her bandaged arm trembling slightly. He could see the fear in her eyes, but also the resolve. She wasn't giving up. Not yet. "If we're doing this," Garrett said, forcing himself to his feet, "we need to move fast. The longer we wait, the worse it'll get." Carter nodded. "We gather supplies, stick together, and head for the lifeboat deck. No detours, no heroics." The journey to the lifeboat deck was fraught with tension. The corridors felt narrower than before, the shadows longer. Every step echoed ominously, and every creak of the ship set Garrett's nerves on edge. Elise walked beside him, her knife gripped tightly in her good hand. Carter led the way, his rifle raised, while the remaining crew members trailed behind, their fear palpable. They reached a junction, the corridor splitting in two. Carter checked the map on his tablet, his brow furrowing. "Left leads to the lifeboats," he said. "But right takes us through the storage deck. We might find more supplies there." "Supplies won't matter if we're dead," Elise said. Carter hesitated, then nodded. "Left it is." They turned the corner and came face to face with a group of infected. The creatures snarled, their bloodshot eyes locking onto the group. Carter fired the first shot, and chaos erupted. Garrett swung his crowbar as one of the infected lunged at him, the impact sending it sprawling. Elise stabbed another, her movements quick and precise. The remaining crew members fought desperately, their makeshift weapons clashing against the horde. "Keep moving," Carter shouted, firing into the crowd. The group pushed forward, the lifeboat deck just ahead. Garrett's arms ached from swinging the crowbar, but he didn't stop. They couldn't afford to stop. The lifeboat deck was eerily quiet. The emergency lights cast a dim glow over the rows of lifeboats, their orange surfaces stark against the darkness. Carter motioned for the group to spread out, checking the area for any signs of infected. "Clear," he said after a moment, lowering his rifle. "Let's get these boats ready." Garrett moved to one of the lifeboats, his hands shaking as he checked the release mechanisms. Elise joined him, her knife still in hand. "We're really doing this?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do we have a choice?" Garrett asked. She didn't respond. Instead, she focused on the lifeboat, her movements methodical. The other crew members worked in silence, the weight of the situation hanging heavily over them. The silence was shattered by a blood-curdling scream. Garrett spun around to see one of the crew members, a young man named Ryan, being dragged into the shadows. His screams were cut short, replaced by the wet, guttural sounds of feeding. "They're here!" Carter shouted, raising his rifle. The infected poured onto the deck, their snarls filling the air. The group fought desperately, the lifeboats forgotten in the chaos. Garrett swung his crowbar, the impact jarring his arms. Elise stayed close, her knife flashing as she defended herself. Ryan reappeared, his face twisted and bloodied. He lunged at one of the other crew members, his movements erratic and violent. The infected crew member tore into his former friend, spreading chaos among the survivors. "Ryan's turned," Elise shouted, stabbing at an infected that came too close. "Take him out," Carter ordered, his voice strained as he fired into the horde. Garrett hesitated for a moment, then swung his crowbar at Ryan. The blow connected, but it wasn't enough. Ryan snarled, his bloodshot eyes locking onto Garrett. He lunged, but Garrett sidestepped, swinging again. This time, the impact crushed Ryan's skull, and he collapsed in a heap. The infected continued to swarm, their numbers overwhelming. Carter fired until his rifle clicked empty, then drew his knife, fighting desperately. Elise screamed as one of the infected grabbed her, its claws raking across her back. Garrett swung his crowbar, knocking the creature away, but more took its place. "We need to go," Carter shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. The survivors piled into the lifeboats, their movements frantic. Garrett helped Elise into one, her face pale and streaked with blood. Carter climbed in after them, slamming the release lever. The lifeboat lurched as it detached from the ship, plummeting toward the churning ocean below. The infected swarmed the edge of the deck, their snarls echoing as they watched the lifeboats descend. Garrett gripped the sides of the lifeboat, his knuckles white. The salty spray of the ocean stung his face, and the cold wind bit at his skin. They hit the water with a jarring splash, the lifeboat rocking violently. Garrett clung to the edge, his heart pounding as he tried to steady himself. Carter grabbed the oars, his movements swift and practiced. "Row," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "We need to get away from the ship." Garrett and Elise joined him, their muscles straining as they rowed into the darkness. The ship loomed behind them, its lights flickering as the infected swarmed the decks. The sounds of their snarls and screams carried across the water, a haunting reminder of what they had escaped. As they drifted further from the ship, the adrenaline began to fade, replaced by exhaustion. Garrett slumped against the side of the lifeboat, his breath ragged. Elise sat beside him, her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Carter stared out at the ocean, his expression unreadable. "We made it," he said quietly, though his tone lacked any sense of triumph. Garrett nodded, but he didn't feel like they had won. The infected were still out there, and the vast, empty ocean stretched endlessly around them. Survival had been the goal, but now it felt like a hollow victory. "What now?" Elise asked, her voice barely audible. Carter didn't answer. He simply stared into the darkness, the weight of their ordeal etched into his features. Garrett followed his gaze, the reality of their situation sinking in. They had escaped the ship, but the fight for survival was far from over. The lifeboat drifted into the night, the infected snarls fading into the distance. But their echoes lingered in Garrett's mind, a haunting reminder of what they had left behind. And as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, it brought no comfort, only the chilling realization that the nightmare was far from over. The lifeboat drifted aimlessly on the open ocean, the horizon a bleak expanse of endless gray. The morning sun, obscured by thick clouds, cast a dim, lifeless light over the survivors. Garrett sat in the stern, his head bowed, the crowbar resting heavily in his lap. His arms ached, and his mind felt like it was unraveling. The events of the last few days played over and over in his head, each memory more vivid and painful than the last. Elise sat across from him, her eyes hollow, her bandaged arm cradled against her chest. Carter was at the bow, staring out at the horizon, his rifle across his knees. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The infected might have been behind them, trapped on the ship, but the weight of their survival pressed down on them like a suffocating fog. Garrett finally broke the silence. "How much food do we have?" Carter didn't turn. "Not enough." "Water?" Elise asked, her voice barely audible. Carter shook his head. "We've got what we brought from the Citadel. A day or two, maybe." Garrett let out a bitter laugh, the sound harsh and alien in the stillness. "We escaped one death trap just to die out here. Great plan." "What else were we supposed to do?" Carter snapped, finally turning to face him. "Stay on that ship and wait to be eaten. At least out here we have a chance." "A chance at what?" Garrett shot back. "Starving to death? Dying of thirst? It's not much of a choice." Elise's voice cut through the tension. "Stop it, both of you." She looked between them, her expression weary but resolute. "We're alive. That's more than we can say for the others. Let's not waste it." The silence returned, heavier this time. Garrett stared down at the crowbar in his lap, the metal stained and battered. It had been his lifeline, his weapon, his companion in the darkness, but now it felt like a relic of a life he no longer recognized. By midday, the first signs of dehydration began to set in. Garrett's lips were cracked, and his head throbbed with every movement. Elise's bandage was soaked through, and her skin was pale. Carter's stoic facade had started to crack. His hands trembled as he clung to the oars, pulling them through the water with diminishing strength. "We need to conserve energy," Elise said, her voice strained. "Rowing aimlessly isn't helping." "We have to keep moving," Carter replied. "If we stop, we'll never get anywhere." "And where are we going?" Garrett asked, his tone bitter. "Do you even know?" Carter didn't answer. He just kept rowing, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Garrett slumped back against the edge of the lifeboat, closing his eyes. He tried to block out the pain, the thirst, the gnawing fear. But the silence was deafening, the memories inescapable. That night, the ocean turned against them. The waves rose, crashing against the lifeboat with brutal force. Garrett clung to the sides, his knuckles white as the boat pitched and rolled. Elise screamed as she was thrown sideways, her injured arm slamming against the edge. Carter shouted orders, his voice barely audible over the roar of the storm. "Hold on," he yelled. "Don't let go." The lifeboat lurched violently, and Garrett's grip slipped. For a terrifying moment, he was weightless, the cold spray of the ocean engulfing him. But then he hit the bottom of the boat, gasping for air as he scrambled to regain his hold. The storm seemed endless, the darkness impenetrable. The infected might have been miles away, but the ocean itself had become their new enemy. By the time the waves began to subside, the survivors were drenched, battered, and shivering uncontrollably. "Is everyone okay?" Carter asked, his voice raw. Elise nodded weakly, her teeth chattering. Garrett coughed, his chest burning. "I'm alive," he managed to say, though it felt like a hollow victory. The following day brought no relief. The sun blazed overhead, turning the lifeboat into an oven. Their meager supply of water was gone, and the ocean stretched endlessly in every direction. Garrett's throat was raw, his vision blurred. Elise was barely conscious, her head resting against the side of the boat. Carter had stopped rowing, his strength finally giving out. "We're not going to make it," Garrett said, his voice cracked and weak. "Don't say that," Carter replied, though his tone lacked conviction. "We'll find land. We just have to keep going." Garrett let out a dry laugh. "Keep going? Look at us. We're already dead." Elise stirred, her eyes fluttering open. "Stop it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "We have to keep fighting. If we give up now, everything we did to survive will mean nothing." Garrett stared at her, the fire in her eyes a stark contrast to his own despair. He nodded reluctantly, though he couldn't shake the feeling that their fight was futile. That night, they spotted it. A faint light on the horizon. Carter was the first to see it, his breath catching as he pointed. "Look," he said, his voice filled with a mix of hope and disbelief. "Over there." Garrett squinted, his heart racing. The light was faint, flickering, but it was there. "What is it?" he asked. "Could be a ship," Carter said. "Or land." Elise's eyes widened. "We have to get there," she said, her voice filled with determination. Carter nodded, grabbing the oars. Garrett joined him, their exhaustion forgotten, as they rowed toward the light. The promise of salvation fueled their movements, their desperation overpowering their fatigue. As they drew closer, the light grew brighter, revealing the silhouette of a large structure. It wasn't a ship. It was an oil rig, its towering metal framework illuminated by floodlights. "We made it," Carter said, his voice trembling. "We're saved." But as they approached, Garrett's relief turned to dread. The rig was eerily silent. No voices, no movement, just the hum of machinery and the distant crash of waves. "Something's not right," Garrett said, his grip tightening on the oar. "It doesn't matter," Elise said. "We have to try." They docked the lifeboat at the base of the rig, climbing the rusted ladder to the main platform. The air was thick with the smell of oil and salt, the wind howling through the metal structures. The rig was massive, a labyrinth of pipes and platforms, but it was devoid of life. "Hello?" Carter called out, his voice echoing. "Is anyone here?" Garrett's heart pounded as he followed Carter and Elise into the rig's main building. The corridors were dark, the walls streaked with grime. They found signs of a struggle, overturned furniture, bloodstains, but no bodies. "This place," Garrett began, but he couldn't finish. The air felt heavy, oppressive. Something was wrong. Elise found a storeroom with water and food. They ate and drank in silence, the brief reprieve doing little to ease their tension. Carter kept his rifle ready, his eyes scanning every shadow. "We should rest," Elise said finally. "We'll figure out what to do in the morning." Garrett nodded, though sleep felt impossible. The rig's silence was unnerving, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The attack came just before dawn. Garrett woke to the sound of snarls and screams, his heart leaping into his throat. The infected were here, their twisted forms silhouetted against the dim emergency lights. Carter fired his rifle, the gunshots deafening in the confined space. Elise screamed as one of the infected grabbed her, its claws tearing into her shoulder. Garrett swung his crowbar, the impact sending the creature crashing into the wall. "We have to get out of here!" Carter shouted, his voice frantic. They fought their way through the corridors, the infected swarming from every direction. Garrett's arms burned, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. Elise stumbled, blood streaming from her wounds. Carter grabbed her, pulling her to her feet. "Keep moving," he yelled. They reached the edge of the platform, the lifeboat far below. Carter turned, firing his last rounds into the horde. "Go!" he shouted. "I'll hold them off!" "No!" Elise screamed. "You can't! Go!" Carter roared, shoving her toward the ladder. Garrett grabbed Elise, dragging her down the ladder as Carter's shouts and gunfire echoed above. They reached the lifeboat, but Garrett hesitated, his heart breaking as he looked back at the rig. The gunfire stopped. Garrett and Elise drifted in silence, the rig a distant silhouette on the horizon. Elise's breathing was shallow, her injuries severe. Garrett held her hand, his tears falling silently as the sun rose over the endless ocean. "We made it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Garrett nodded, though he didn't believe it. The infected were still out there, and the ocean was vast and unforgiving. Their survival felt like a cruel joke, a prolonging of the inevitable. As Elise's eyes closed, her breathing slowing, Garrett stared out at the horizon. The fight was over, but the nightmare would never end. The lifeboat rocked gently in the morning waves, the first light of dawn casting an eerie glow over the endless expanse of water. Garrett sat at the stern, his eyes red and sunken, his body racked with exhaustion. Elise lay beside him, her breathing shallow but steady. The gash on her shoulder oozed through its makeshift bandage, her pale skin a stark contrast to the rising sun. For hours, Garrett had stared at the horizon, his hope flickering like the dying flame of a candle. Carter was gone. The oil rig was a nightmare that had claimed everything they had left. Now it was just him and Elise, adrift in a lifeboat that felt more like a coffin. Then he saw it, a jagged line on the horizon, land. Garrett blinked, his heart stuttering as the shape solidified. Trees, rooftops, and a distant pier came into view, shrouded in the morning mist. "Elise," he croaked, shaking her gently. "Wake up, we're here." Her eyelids fluttered, her lips cracking as she whispered, "Land?" Garrett nodded, gripping the oars. Every stroke sent a jolt of pain through his muscles, but he pushed on, the sight of the shoreline driving him forward. Elise propped herself up, her eyes wide with disbelief and a faint glimmer of hope. The lifeboat scraped against the sandy shore, the soft hiss of waves breaking against the hull. Garrett leapt out, his boots sinking into the wet sand. He turned back to help Elise, her steps unsteady as she clung to his arm. "We made it," she whispered, tears streaking her dirt-smudged face. Garrett didn't respond. He scanned the coastline, his grip tightening on the crowbar. The air was still, too still. No birds, no wind, just the rhythmic sound of waves lapping at the shore. The town was close, its rooftops barely visible through the dense fog. Garrett and Elise moved cautiously, their footsteps crunching against the gravel path leading from the beach. The town seemed frozen in time, its narrow streets eerily quiet. Houses stood with their doors ajar, windows shattered, the remnants of a life long abandoned. Garrett tightened his grip on the crowbar, his pulse quickening. The stench of decay grew stronger as they approached the town square. Elise stumbled, her injury slowing her down. "Let's find somewhere to rest," he said, his voice low. "You need to sit down." "No," Elise insisted, shaking her head. "We need to find supplies, food, water. We can't stop." Garrett frowned but didn't argue. She was right. Their survival depended on what they could scavenge from the ghost town. They reached the center of town, where an old church loomed over the square. The bell tower was silent, its cracked facade a testament to years of neglect. Garrett approached cautiously, his eyes scanning every shadow. The square was littered with debris, abandoned cars, overturned carts, and dried bloodstains on the cobblestones. "Do you hear that?" Elise asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Garrett froze, his breath catching. At first it was faint, almost imperceptible, but then it grew louder, a low, guttural moan that sent a shiver down his spine. They came shambling out of the shadows, their twisted forms emerging from alleyways and doorways. Dozens of them, their eyes lifeless, their jaws slack. The undead. "Run!" Garrett shouted, grabbing Elise's hand. They sprinted toward the church, the infected closing in behind them. Garrett slammed the heavy wooden doors shut, bracing them with a pew. Elise collapsed against the wall, her chest heaving. "What now?" she gasped, clutching her injured arm. Garrett looked around, his mind racing. The church was dimly lit, its stained glass windows casting fractured colors across the pews. An old spiral staircase led up to the bell tower. "Up there," he said, pointing. "We can get a better view from the tower. Maybe find another way out." Elise nodded weakly, and they climbed the creaking stairs, each step a painful effort. At the top, they emerged onto the narrow platform, the town sprawling below them. The infected swarmed the square, their moans rising like a grotesque chorus. "There," Garrett said, pointing to a hardware store on the far edge of town. "We'll find tools, maybe weapons, but we'll have to go through them to get there." Elise swallowed hard. "We don't have a choice." The descent was harrowing. The undead pounded against the church doors, their snarls echoing through the sanctuary. Garrett pushed aside the pew, holding his breath as the doors creaked open. The infected spilled in, their grotesque forms staggering toward him. "Go," he shouted, swinging the crowbar. Elise darted past him, her knife flashing as she slashed at the nearest infected. Garrett followed, his crowbar connecting with bone and flesh. They fought their way through the square, the infected closing in on all sides. Garrett's muscles burned, his breaths ragged as he swung the crowbar again and again. Elise stumbled, a clawed hand grazing her leg. Garrett grabbed her, pulling her to her feet. "Keep moving," he yelled. They reached the hardware store, slamming the door shut behind them. Garrett leaned against the counter, his chest heaving. Elise collapsed onto a pile of tarps, her face pale and streaked with blood. "We can't keep this up," she said, her voice trembling. "There's too many of them." Garrett nodded, his mind racing. The store was filled with tools and supplies, hammers, saws, nails. He grabbed a length of chain and a pair of bolt cutters, his hands shaking. "We'll make it," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "We have to." Night fell quickly, the town plunging into darkness. The infected prowled the streets, their moans a constant reminder of the danger lurking outside. Garrett and Elise barricaded themselves in a back room of the hardware store, the door reinforced with shelves and crates. Elise lay on a makeshift bed of tarps, her breathing shallow. Garrett sat beside her, the crowbar resting across his knees. He stared at the flickering light of their makeshift lantern, his thoughts a chaotic tangle of fear and regret. "Do you think there's anywhere safe?" Elise asked, her voice barely audible. Garrett hesitated. I don't know, he admitted, but we can't stop looking. She closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. I'm tired, Garrett. I don't know how much more I can take. He reached out, gripping her hand tightly. You don't have to do this alone. We'll get through this, together. The words felt hollow, but he needed her to believe them. He needed to believe them. The infected found them at dawn. The barricade held for only a few minutes before the shelves splintered, the creatures forcing their way inside. Garrett and Elise fought desperately, their weapons flashing in the dim light. Upstairs! Garrett shouted, pulling Elise toward the stairs at the back of the store. They scrambled up to the second floor, slamming the door shut behind them. The infected pounded against it, their snarls growing louder. Garrett searched the room, his eyes landing on a window overlooking the alley. We can climb down, he said, grabbing a length of rope. Elise nodded, her face pale but determined. Garrett tied the rope to a sturdy shelf, lowering it out the window. He helped Elise climb down, her injured arm trembling as she clung to the rope. As she reached the ground, the door behind him splintered. Garrett turned, his heart racing as the infected burst through. He swung the crowbar, the impact jarring his arms. Garrett, hurry, Elise shouted from below. He grabbed the rope, sliding down as the infected clawed at his heels. The moment his feet hit the ground, Elise grabbed his hand, pulling him toward the edge of town. They reached the outskirts as the sun rose, its golden light casting long shadows over the fields beyond. The infected still swarmed the town, their moans echoing in the distance. Garrett and Elise stumbled into the tall grass, their breaths ragged, their bodies battered. They collapsed beneath a gnarled tree, the silence of the countryside a stark contrast to the chaos they had just escaped. Elise leaned against Garrett, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. We made it, she whispered, though her voice lacked conviction. Garrett stared out at the horizon, the fields stretching endlessly before them. He knew better. The town had been a cruel reminder that no place was safe, that the fight was far from over. For now, he said quietly, gripping the crowbar. For now.